Jeff, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. This is going to be fun. I love talking about podcasts.
Yeah, man, and I'm excited to get to know you. Definitely familiar with Podglomerate and what you guys are doing, but have never officially met you. So excited to talk to a fellow podcast agency owner. But just before we get into it, just to kind of set the tone for the listeners and to get a little bit about who you are, where are you originally from?
I grew up in New Hampshire, a town called Exeter. I spent, a dozen years in New York in between. And in 2021, I moved back to New Hampshire, a town right next to Exeter called Portsmouth. So I love it here.
And like growing up, did you kind of see yourself as an entrepreneur? Did you have any like of those traits? I know you hear like the whole classic, well, I sold candy as a kid or any of that. Or were you like, did you have your eyes set on like a career or kind of like, what was that like?
I was convinced that I was going to be some famous like J.D. Salinger type. I worked in bookstores growing up. I was a writing major in college. My first job out of school was as a book publicist. My second job out of school was as a book publicist. My first job was like a 4-month gig that I had marketing an iPhone app development company, which actually, as I think back, is probably the first point in which like I saw a glimmer of like entrepreneurship. But I mean, I'll be honest, like I never had any desire to be an entrepreneur. It was never anything I set out to do. I eventually launched this company because I couldn't get a job making podcasts. So no, I was a salesman at the bookshop that I worked at, and I had a million other jobs that like taught me a lot of the elements that I use today. But I don't think it was very intentional that I ended up doing what I do today.
Dude, that's funny because I kind of me too, like where I couldn't get a job. So I had a few, but I have an audio engineer as a background and I used to freelance at like different studios here in Los Angeles, but it always seemed like I could never get like a good, like steady gig. I mean, I did some good things that I'm proud of and worked on some stuff, but like it was always like very freelance or very part-time. And it was hard to get like a steady gig. I don't know why. I feel like I always sucked at interviews too. Even before that, even like when I was younger with like just, crappy jobs, I always, so I don't know. So it's interesting how that happens. And then you kind of like create it for yourself.
Yeah. I definitely fell into it. It's funny. I had one job post-college that I consider a real job. And I had that for 7 years. I moonlit a little bit for like third-party companies. And then I launched Podglomerate, which is now the longest tenured job that I've ever had. And it's the exact opposite of every friend that I ever had. I don't know if it's like a millennial thing, but everyone I know lasts about 2 years at their job and then gets a new one. So I feel like I'm the outlier in that equation because I like to keep jobs for a long time and like really like absorb as much as I can. But also, it's crazy for me to say that because the longest job I've ever had is like 8 years. And if you ask like our parents' generation, like most of them had their job for like 20 plus,
Oh, yeah.
So.
And so prior to Podglomerate, did you want to work in podcasting? Had you been listening to podcasts? Because it's funny because a lot of people didn't even start listening to podcasts, I feel like, till the pandemic. But like, what was that like? Were you listening to them? Were you like, was it a writing thing? Like, I want to write not true crime, but maybe true crime or whatever, something like narrative stuff or no?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's funny. I feel like this is like kind of everybody's like first experience with podcasting, but I had a friend in high school that burned me a CD with a bunch of episodes of This American Life.
In high school?
In high school, yeah.
Wow.
Which for me was 2002 to 2006. And
Similar.
he'd like downloaded them from iTunes, and I think you could only fit like 3 episodes on a CD or something at that point. And so that was my first experience. I also grew up, my mom would listen to the radio. Like she listened to Delilah when she was like driving to my baseball games, which if you know Delilah, it's hilarious because it's like, this woman, I can't tell if she's crazy or like a saint, but she is famous for having like like 7 husbands and adopting like 18 kids. And but she's like, she is a legend. She's like the 5th most listened to radio personality in the world, or the US anyway. And it's very much like, you know, she'll take phone calls from somebody who's like having a rough day with their husband or something, and then she'll tell him like, oh, I got this song for you, and then you'll hear like Celine Dion or something. And I just have memories of me like growing up listening to that in the backseat of my parents' car. And then the This American Life stuff, and then I just became a consumer. I was like everybody else. Like when I really jumped on the bandwagon, it was like around startup and Serial and Reply All, and like the early 2010s when all of that stuff was really blowing up. And I started a podcast when I was a book publicist called Writers Who Don't Write, where I would interview authors about like their careers and one story they could never tell. And it was a like silly little conceit that my friend Kyle and I came up with because both of us had these dreams of becoming these big authors, and like we kept on coming up with excuses for why we didn't want to write these stories in our head. And so we're just like, let's just ask everybody else that's already done it, like how they got over that hump. And I did that for 4 years, and just kind of fell in love with it. And this was at the tail end of my book PR days. And like towards the end of that tenure, I kind of just said to myself, like, I have this one thing that I love doing. I don't know how I'm going to make money doing it. And then I have this other thing that like I used to love, but it's just not for me anymore. So like, let's take that leap. Life is short. And I did. And I launched Podglomerate in January of 2017.
Very cool, dude. And it's interesting how, yeah, you started that first podcast and then you were probably like, well, I don't know everything, but I at least know how to like put a podcast together. And that's probably more than most people. So maybe I can, was it kind of like, I can take this experience and then try to do this thing with and build a company out. Was it like super deep? Oh, go ahead.
It was actually like very backwards.
Okay.
So today Podglomerate does 3 things. We produce podcasts, we market them, and we monetize them. When I officially launched the company, I tried to, it's a funny story. I had this podcast, Writers Who Don't Write. It was getting like, I don't know, 5,000 downloads an episode. But
Solid.
We were getting, yeah. And this was way back. So like, who knows how many actual listeners that are when you look at like the metrics of today. But I was getting a lot of emails from listeners, like real people who loved the show. And I'm just like, oh, this is awesome. And a couple companies came up to me, companies that you know, and said like, we'd love to sell ads on your show. I told them how large the show was, and then they said, I'm so sorry, you're too small for us to do this effectively. And like that really annoyed me because I'm just like, well, we clearly have an audience. Like, why don't you guys want to sell against it? Today, I know why that is. Like the unit economics just don't make sense on a show of that scale. But at the time I was telling myself like, this is crazy. There's a market fit. Somebody's not doing this. I'm going to do it. So I went out and I got a collection of like 10 shows that were about the same size as Writers Who Don't Write. I put them together, I bundled them, and I would go to all of the ad agencies and try to sell them. And that was the like initial genesis of the Podglomerate. And the idea was that like I would also make my own shows that I could plug into this network. So I'd like monetize it through the sales, and then I'd make these cool shows that I had fun doing, and I'd be able to monetize those because I'd already built these relationships. I learned very quickly that wasn't going to work. And
like a network kind of, you were like forming your own network basically.
That's exactly what it was. And like, I didn't even have the language to call it that at the time. So I did that and I built it, and it like made some money, but it was just very small scale. I was still like freelancing as a book publicist to pay my rent. And I started making shows like I planned. Eventually I got really lucky and I got a couple people who hired me to make them these podcasts. So I had a couple production deals to help supplement what I was doing on the network side. And this whole time, my buddy Kyle, who I was making Writers Who Don't Write with, kept on telling me over and over again, like, hey man, you have this skill set of promoting books, and a podcast is basically a book. So like, why don't you start offering that as a service? And for like a year, I kept telling him like, no, that's silly. Nobody wants that. That's exactly what I'm trying to get away from. And eventually somebody asked me if I would do it. And I said yes, because I needed the money. And all of a sudden that became the business model, where I would, charge a fee to run a promotional campaign on a podcast. And it kept developing into like a more robust growth like engine, and more people kept on asking me to do this work. And that's, ultimately like how we got to where we are today. Like, we still do the network side, we still do the production side, and we still do the marketing side. It's just now we have 10 employees and we work with like these world renowned shows, and we get to do it like more and better, is I guess the way to put it.
So yeah, the marketing, that was really kind of like what kicked things off. Would you say that that's like your expertise, or is it more, or what do you enjoy more, the marketing or like the production? Kind of, where do you fit in that? Sounds like marketing. That's why.
Well, it's funny. Marketing makes up a little more than a third of our total revenue. So like all of the departments are profitable at this point. And but they're all different. Like, we have like half of our employees work in the marketing department, and then the rest are divided between production and monetization. So like there's a lot of mechanics that go into like how we determine like what's profitable and what's not. But that is the biggest part of the business, which is, it shifts every couple of years. Like at some point, like I'm sure production will top out on that, and then at some point monetization will. And then marketing will come back, and it's a cyclical thing. But in terms of what I enjoy the most, it's a funny question, because
or just running shit. Do you enjoy like running the whole thing?
I hate running shit. That is the part that I kind of despise. There are moments where like it's really fun, and like there are some benefits and privileges of being the one who started everything. But I really enjoy making shows. And it's funny because like I'm fine at it, but I don't think I'm like particularly talented there. I know what to do, and I know the mechanical side of it, and I know like how to build a business model behind a show. But I'm a pretty lousy like reporter and producer. I'm great at recognizing talented people, and I've hired them to help me. But that is where I have the most fun. And what I'm best at probably is the marketing side. But we have like a really amazing team for all of our departments that are doing like, most of the heavy lifting when it comes to all of this work. I do find myself as a little bit of like a pinch hitter. So whenever like we need a little extra muscle in any of those areas, like I get a Slack message or an email, and I jump in and spend a few hours trying to help out where I can. So that's kind of where I see myself today. I have 3 jobs really. One is to make sure that there's money in the bank. 2 is to make sure that like everybody's happy. And 3 is to make sure that like I'm not going to go insane. So.
And are you guys all remote?
Yeah, we have 10 employees in 7 states.
Cool, man. I love that. And I love like kind of the whole impetus of it was like this DIY thing, and you had a podcast that was by most standards successful, and then it kind of happened. Love that DIY approach. So like, who's your ideal client? Do you guys serve a specific group or sector, just for the audience sake, so they in the event that they may want to work with you, or just to
Sure.
get some more education out there about who you are and who you serve?
Yeah, I appreciate that. We have a lot of experience working with like universities, think tanks, media companies, and what I would call like institutional clients. So like nonprofits and stuff. And that traditionally is the makeup of the people that we work with. But in terms of like an ideal client, I think it's really just like somebody who understands like what their goals are, and like has a KPI in mind to measure that. I'm sure you deal with this all the time. But
Oh yeah, because it's kind of like a buzzword now. It's like every company thinks they need to have a podcast, and maybe they do, but like, yeah, it's kind of like, well, why are you doing it? What do you hope to achieve?
Exactly.
You're probably not going to monetize it. Maybe you will, but like, yeah, it's probably not to make money. A lot of these people, it's brand awareness,
lead generation, thought leadership, brand awareness. Like,
do you find that they know that, or you have to kind of coach them through that?
I'd say it's about 50-50. That's always the first question that I ask. And to this day, I'm still surprised at how many people don't have an answer.
Yeah.
So
yeah, same with me on this show. I'm like,
yeah,
why am I doing this? No.
Yeah. Well, but that's the thing. It's like, I actually, it's funny. I'm friendly with Ashley Carmen, who is the podcast writer at Bloomberg. As we record this today, actually, she just published an article that I'm quoted in. And it is all about how people are using podcasts to, like, kind of a little bit like Trojan horse their way into a meeting, and like booking an interview with somebody so that they can sit down and talk to them for an hour. And that all was kind of the result of a conversation that I assume, I can't really say this, but I believe that this was a result of a conversation that we had a while ago where I told her about one of our clients who they sold this like really expensive software. It was a SaaS company. Every month they would make like $50K if they got a client. And they started a podcast so that they could bring in like CMOs of the companies of people who might hire them. And they would basically just get to sit in a room with them for an hour or two and had an excuse to follow up with them over email and talk to them about this service. And so they were spending, whatever they spent on the podcast. And then any time that they actually got a client, they made that back like tenfold. So yeah, I don't know. It's, there's a million reasons why people would start a podcast or should start one. But the thing I always tell people is like, should you start a podcast, or should you buy ads on a podcast, or should you try to get interviewed on podcasts? Like, podcasts are great, and everybody should have them as some part of their media plan, but that doesn't mean you have to make one.
I like that. Yeah, maybe being a guest to get your name or your company's name kind of out there. And the networking piece, like you said, is huge. Like, you get to meet, I've met a lot of people just largely remotely, but just developing those relationships in the industry, and that, who knows how that's going to come in handy in the future, but relationships and connecting is always key.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's probably, weirdly, my favorite part about podcasting in general. Like, when I started Writers Who Don't Write, like, I was just a, schmuck book publicist that like nobody really knew. And I got to sit down and have conversations with like my idols.
Really?
We had Lev Grossman and Stephanie Dandler and Peter Heller and like a million more. And I just got to sit there and ask them questions about these books that I'd loved. And I'm actually like very sad most of the time thinking about how like I don't make the show anymore. I just got too busy and couldn't keep doing it. But now I have a podcast called Podcast Perspectives, where I do something really similar, and I talk to people in the podcast space, and like it kind of operates like in a similar way and lets me flex that muscle a little bit. So that part's nice. And
I'm assuming the show, even though you're not active, it's still up, right? It's still live on all the platforms, right?
Yeah, I do not recommend that people listen to it, but yes, it is live. It's that was like the baby version of me who like I'm really proud of it. It's just like I'm embarrassed by many of the things I said a decade ago.
That's what I was going to ask. So that was almost a decade ago, or a decade ago?
Yeah, I think we launched it in 2014.
Wow. And were you doing the editing and like the audio production, or
for a minute work? I was. And that's part of why I don't think people should listen. It's not very good. But we, my buddy Kyle, who co-hosted the show with me, is like a very talented video and audio developer or editor, and he was the one who really took the lead on that. I would go in and I do like the first cut most of the time, and make it sound presentable, and then he'd go in and do like the final mix and master. But yeah, I edited probably a third of those episodes, and that's why some of them don't sound great. But
I hear stories about like like the quote unquote like glory days, and maybe even before that, earlier on. I work on one show. I've only been working with them in the last like 2 years, but they launched in 2000. It's called The Art of Charm.
oh yeah, yeah, I know those guys well.
And they told me that I think it was like I could, this is probably wrong, but like maybe 2006 or something. And they're like,
Yeah.
dude, back then you release an episode and there wasn't a lot of podcasts and your downloads would just be going up, up, up all the time. And like, it was so
Yeah.
easy to get like tens of thousands of downloads. And you were saying your show at around
Yeah.
5,000 downloads. I mean, and that's 2014. Even then it was probably a lot easier to build an audience just because there wasn't as much of the content, right? Did you do anything like actively to market, or did it just kind of happen? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
I'm like, it just
we
happened.
no, it was a little organic for sure, but like we were written up in newsletters, and Apple put us into a Noteworthy, and Spotify did some stuff with us. And but it's funny. It's I don't know if you remember this article, but there is an article from like it's probably from 2015, 2016 in the New York Times talking about Steve Wilson, who's now at Q Code, but at the time was like the only guy that worked at Apple Podcasts. And this article was called God, I forget the name of the article, but it was some version of The Man Who Can Make You Famous or something. And he was talking about how he was like a kingmaker, because he had the ability to put you on that carousel in Apple or New and Noteworthy. And to your point, like there really was not that much competition. It was not nearly as saturated as it is today. And if you got that kind of real estate, then you were going to get a lot of people who clicked on your show. And that's exactly what happened with Serial and Startup and Joe Rogan and Mark Maron. And
Maron. Yeah. What the fuck with Maron? Yeah. He was early.
Exactly. Yes. And those shows are all still amazing and like doing well, but like with everything that's happened over the years and like the data consumption and like what's available to us to figure out like what's a listener versus a download and everything, like I would love more than anything to have that data from like 15 years ago to see like how it compares to today.
Yeah. Were you, I feel like Libsyn was one of the main ones back then. Who did you host the show with?
Initially it was Libsyn.
Okay.
There was actually a minute where we were on SoundCloud. And then we went to Acast, and then at one point we were on Simplecast. Now we're on Megaphone. I've basically used, because of the nature of like my history and all of the shows that we work with. We work at any given moment with more than 100 podcasts. I have like seen basically every hosting platform at this point.
Yeah.
But there was a time where I was on Libsyn. Yes.
They were like, one of the OGs. But Jeff, tell me about, because one thing I'm really interested in, and I'd like to kind of get in more of it myself, but tell me about like original content versus like your client shows. Was the original content, like how does that work? Do people come to you with ideas? Do you have ideas and then seek out hosts and stuff, or what's that like?
Sure. It's a little bit like the flavor of the year. But some of the original shows that we have produced have been people who approached us, and some of them are things that we have come up with and commissioned. So the two like most recent and notable ones would be Podcast Perspectives, which is basically my version of your show. And I make that for a bunch of reasons, but one, I like doing it and it's fun to talk to people in the space. Two, it Allows me to create a bunch of content that I can publish on all of the different platforms. Three, it allows me a platform to experiment with, so I don't have to experiment with client shows. Four, it's a great way for lead generation and for me to like get meetings with people and that kind of thing. So we make a show where it's audio and video, and I publish every 2 weeks. I have a lot of fun doing it. We also made a show a couple of years ago in 2022 called Missing Pages, which was a literary true crime. We did 2 seasons of it. It's hosted by book reviewer Beth Ann Patrick, who's this like wonderful, smart, like world-renowned book reviewer. And we essentially like covered like the dark underbelly of the book publishing industry. So banned books and like scammers in the space and that kind of thing. It was super fun. It was really, really expensive. The purpose of that was to like build a portfolio piece, win awards, get critical acclaim, make some money,
Get IP.
yeah, and it worked. Like I had a list of 10 goals. We made 9 of them happen, and the 10th was make money, and we didn't do that. So, and if I could go back in time, like I would do it totally differently. Like the reason that we couldn't monetize that was because it was a limited series that published in the middle of like the ad apocalypse in 2022. But in like, you know, today I would tell you like make some kind of broad audience oriented show that is always on and can command an audience for a long time to come, which I know is probably easier said than done. But we anyway, with Missing Pages, like it was great. I'm glad we did it. We didn't renew it for a 3rd season, and we probably shouldn't have for a 2nd based on everything I just talked about, but I just liked doing it. So for the originals, like it kind of depends on what makes sense. We had a few shows over the years, like The Wave with Matt Fuller and Writers Who Don't Write and Storybound and a couple of others that were ideas that like people brought to us that we wanted to see in the world. So we made them. But today, I don't know. I don't know if I'm rambling too much, but I view
No. It's interesting.
I view like there are 3 kind of tiers of like productions in my opinion. One is a work for hire production, like a white label thing. So you, Eric, come to me and say, I want to make a podcast to promote my business. I will give you X dollars per episode to develop and create this thing. And then we do it. And like, we are work for hire service for you. 2 is what I would call like a distribution deal. So there's some kind of partnership happening. So maybe I'm producing a podcast that I've come up with and am selling to Odyssey or Apple or something. Or maybe like you come to me with this idea and say like, Jeff, I want to partner with you on this. Let's share IP, or like I'll pay you, but then I want to recoup that from like the ad sales before we have a split or whatever. So that's some kind of development partnership deal. And then the 3rd would just be original IP, where you are producing something to own in order to monetize that in some way. And so that's kind of how I break it all down now. I'm frankly, like I'm interested in all 3. But if you ask me today, like I'm much more interested in the work for hire stuff, just because we all have bills to pay. But if you like just handed me a few $1 million, then I have a few shows in mind that I would make. So
for sure. Yeah. The work for hire, that's largely what I do. And yeah, it's kind of the easiest, I guess, if you're, but I guess that could differ depending on the project. So as far as like your growth and marketing arm, like what kind of channels or outlets are you plugging shows into? Is it like buying ads? Is it swaps? Is it like buying features on like the like Overcast and Pocket Cat, like the ones that let you buy like ad space for like banner ads? Is it a little bit of everything, or do you focus mainly on one kind of outlet?
Yeah. So we have what we call our 5-tier approach. So publicity, marketing, cross promotion, pitching the apps, and paid acquisition. We do a little bit of all of that. We like to make it like a big holistic campaign. That said, like depending on what your goals are, there are things that are going to work better than others. So if your goal is like thought leadership, depending on like who you are and what you're doing, then the PR side is going to be really important, because you need that 3rd-party validation to show people that this is like the real deal. And that could be like an interview or review, a feature, a list of shows surrounding certain topics. Like if you're making a food podcast, it's pretty cool if like Eater makes a list of like the top 10 food podcasts. And the second, lever would be marketing, which is just like how to use your owned and operated channels to promote a show. So, newsletter, website, social media. And then there's a lot of ways that you can track attribution on this stuff to show like what works and what doesn't. And then you can iterate on that to do more of the stuff that does and less of the stuff that doesn't. Cross promos are a really great way, in a free way for many people to grow a show. So you can, interview on other shows. You can run feed drops. You can, which is publishing an episode of your show on somebody else's feed, or you can run audio swaps. And there's a lot of tools where you can track attribution on that, so you can see what's effective. Podglomerate has run more than 150 million impressions in that regard, and we have data on all of it, so we know it's the best.
That's dope. Good for you.
Yeah,
that's huge.
It's a fun spreadsheet, but we know exactly like how effective all this stuff is based on like whether it's 30 seconds versus 60 seconds, or host versus producer, or what's in the script and what your call to action is, and what genre or category you're in. That all matters, and anybody can do it. Like, if you're listening to this and you have $0 to promote your show, like just pull up your show on Apple, scroll to the bottom. It'll tell you like a list of recommended podcasts that other people are listening to today and that are subscribed to your show. And then just shoot them an email. You can find it on like, their Twitter feed, Podchaser, a few other places, and say like, hey, I'd be interested in collaborating. Would you be open to a cross promo? And there you go. Fourth bucket is pitching the apps for features, editorial or algorithmic or paid. And then the fifth bucket would be paid acquisition, like what you were talking about, like Overcast and Podcast Addict and stuff. And with everything, like there's a lot of stuff that is more effective than other things, but ultimately, like there is a lot of different ways to do this, and there's no one right or wrong way, but there are certainly things that have like been proven to be more effective. But it really comes down to like, are you looking for just sheer numbers? Are you looking for lead generation? Are you looking for qualified listeners? And I think most people are in the bucket of like qualified listeners. And there's a different approach for that as opposed to like sheer numbers.
I like that though. Like the different approaches depending on the type of show, and then like what the goals are and what might work better for that type of show and that person's goals. Got two more questions. I know you got to get out of here. What do you think these days, and unless you're creating a podcast strictly to like have beers with your friends and talk and shoot the shit and have fun, like not including those people, but do you think that like it's necessary these days to have a paid strategy, or do you think people, and this is a loaded question, but can have success with just like organic marketing techniques?
Yes, 100%. I like to think of paid as kind of like a superpower that can like speed up your audience growth and development.
It's tough though. The organic thing is tough.
Yeah, but that's the thing. It's like, that's what you really have to ask yourself. Like, you should be talking about how you're going to market this thing the day that you decide to make the thing. Because I don't know, it's like the whole, if a tree falls in the woods and nobody, hears it, did it really, nobody sees it, like did it make a sound? Like you want to be thinking about how you're going to put this out in the world. And if you're going to make a show with a goal in mind of like, driving thought leadership or awareness or lead gen or whatever, like you need to think about how you're going to actually reach those people. And that could be through like your own channels. If you're a brand, like maybe your company has a newsletter that's really effective, and you should look into that before you make the show. Like how many people are subscribed? What's the click-through rate? What's the open rate? Like if we have done similar promotions in the past, like how effective was it? Like I know Podglomerate has like, a few thousand people on our newsletter list. I know if I put a link in there, I know exactly how many people are going to click it, like within some margin of error. And like, it's not hard information to find. So everybody should be looking into doing that. There's also like partnerships and like creative like collaborations with other people. So anyway, I'm rambling a little bit, but like the point really is that there are ways to do it. It's not always easy, but as long as you're out there like trying to make the best thing that you can make and really like add value and contribute to the conversation, there's probably people out there who want to listen to it. And like we see it time and time again. It is really hard to find the organic stuff that works. But like there is some kind of like initial contribution that you have to just put into this, like, and understand that you're not going to have overnight success on what you're trying to do here. Like there's you have to allocate like the time, resources, and in a lot of cases budget to like do this the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. The newsletter, I've had good luck with newsletters because those are kind of like your peeps. Like they subscribed to your newsletter, so obviously they're interested in what you're doing. A lot less luck on like across social media. That's a whole other conversation. But Jeff, I think social media is tough. Like the clips and like those don't do anything. I feel like everyone, well, maybe not businesses and a certain level of client, but all like the creator-led shows, you know, they want like 1 million clips for an interview. It's like, huh?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's kind of twofold because like social media stuff is great, like, but that's not the thing that's going to really drive actual clicks and traffic. And like I have 1 million data points to prove that. And sure. Even like, you know, publishing like a YouTube short to drive to the podcast, like I've seen has been really ineffective in many cases. Like there's outliers to that, but like short form is tough to lead to long form. But that's kind of, I guess the overall point though, is like, you need to dedicate a lot of like time to really hitting your goals and like, you know, showing people that you really mean it, and you're like in it for the long haul. And part of that is like just sitting down on day one and defining what your goals are and like making sure that they're realistic. So for example, like I had somebody come to me the other day who said like, my goal is to get 100,000 downloads on my show in the first 6 months. And it was a really niche show. I told him
goal.
Like, yes. and I told him like, you know, it's not that this is impossible or by any means, but like, you can't just say that without having a plan behind how you're going to do it. And so we talked through what that plan was. And like at the end of the conversation, I said like, it is more likely that you are going to land at like 10 to 20,000 downloads in your first 6 months of doing this. And also like, you know, you need to consider what that means in terms of actual human beings listening to this, as opposed to just some download metric. And like, is this still worth it for you to do that? And that was a great conversation because now he's either not going to do it, and save everybody like, you know, having a bad experience in 6 months, or he does. And like, he goes into it with like much more realistic expectations. And I think everybody needs to ask themselves those same questions.
I love that. I think that's important. And I agree. I think people need to do that more. Hell, I need to do it more. I tend to fly by the seat of my pants, but, yeah, that is really good advice. Jeff, tell the good people where they can find you, plug away. What do you got going on? And where can people reach out?
Yeah, I am at podglomerate.com. If anybody wants to chat, shoot a note to listen@thepodglomerate.com. All of our socials are just Podglomerate or Podglomerate Pods. And yeah, thank you, Eric. This was super fun. I'm glad that we got to do this.
Hell yeah, man. We'll talk to you soon.
Cool. Until then.